Because it keeps you alive to what people are writing about, other people at the same time. I mean, I've learned a lot from reading other people's work. I've seen how people can structure books and really make them work. I get excited when somebody's doing a beautiful book. Jennifer Egan's book, the Goons Visit from the Goon Squad. I was just ecstatic reading that book because it was original and fresh, and she was making it work. I feel like it was a tightrope walk, and she was. It was like thrilling to watch. I just finished reviewing the new book by the author of Seabiscuit, Laura Hillenbrand. And when I was working on the book, I suddenly realized that she'd structured it with a 2-page beginning of a kind of dramatic moment, and then come back around 150 pages later and followed. Well, the novel I'm working on right now, I just have been involved in restructuring with an early glimpse and then going back and looping back and then coming into the middle of it again. And I thought, I'm not writing anything like Laura Hillenbrand, but it was very useful for me to say, well, how much did she repeat, and so forth. I mean, I learn a lot when I'm working on reviews and watching really good writers at work. So I think that's one of the advantages of being in that conversation as well.
Do you think your reviews slant toward that review? Do you think that as you're reviewing a book, you're particularly attentive to how a general reader might not be as attentive, for example, to how a book is made, the bones of a book, how it's, those kinds of things, because they're reading it maybe for other reasons, and they're not really taking apart how the book is made. Do you feel that fiction writers do that more as reviewers, or do you notice any difference, say, in the way maybe Daniel Mendelsohn would approach reviewing, the way someone who writes fiction would approach reviewing? And do you think it matters to the reader of the review?
I think it's innate. I mean, one of the things that I ended up thinking when I was thinking about this topic before we came on is that in almost every way, it's a real problem for a critic to also be a fiction writer. The more the more I get into writing fiction, the larger the conflict seems to be. But that is probably the one respect, I think, in which fiction writing enriches my criticism. Because you do see a little bit just the bones of a book more, because you've been engaged in the task of putting together a skeleton yourself. Imagine talking, you talk to an architecture critic about the Chrysler Building, then you talk to a steelworker about the Chrysler Building. The steelworker has some interesting stuff to say. So I think there's a little bit of that, yeah.
What do you think, Roxanne?
I mean, I think that in any review, you're picking and choosing what you're going to talk about. So you can talk about the architecture, you can talk about the structure, or you can talk about how the book just carries you away, like Jennifer Egan's book, which I agree with you about. So you can, there are a million things a writer can say about any book. You can just choose your channel. And for me, I like to write about whatever I find most powerful. So sometimes it's the structure, sometimes it's the narrative, sometimes it's the characters.
Ooh, I want to bring up an example. I wrote a review of Josh Ferris's novel that came out, must have been February this year, The Unnamed, and it's about a guy who has this mental illness which is sort of ruining his life. And right towards the beginning of right toward the very, very end, I think of the first of part one, maybe a third of the way the book. The third of the way through the book, the guy gets a letter from a noted neurologist, sort of an Oliver Sacks type, and the guy saying, "I heard about your case. I have some really interesting ideas about how we might cure you. I think if you could come and visit me and spend some time with me, we could really work together and maybe crack this thing." And I thought, oh, Josh, wow, so this is where it's going to go. He's going to go meet this paternal, avuncular figure, who will help him work through his internal conflicts, and everyone will feel more in touch with their feelings by the end of it. And I thought, well, that's fine. That's a good way to go. But the character after he reads the letter, he stops. And then he rips up the letter and throws it in the trash because he's so hopeless and crushed he can't even bear to go through another treatment. And then the novel goes off in a different direction. And I thought, God damn, that is some discipline right there. Because it would have been much easier to write that other book, but maybe not as sort of ruthless, not as principled. And I thought, wow, that's discipline. It would have been so tempting to take the book off in that direction. And he didn't do it. He just ripped up the letter. I don't know if I would have seen that if I hadn't, felt that temptation myself as a fiction writer.
I have two more questions before we open it to questions that you might have for one another or the audience might have. But one question I have, and I can't resist since we have a couple of board members from the National Book Critics Circle here, but one of them the president. Means of delivery aside, is there anything that worries you about the future of criticism in the United States or the state of criticism in the United States, or are you just feeling pretty good about it overall? Means of delivery aside.
I go first.
No, you're the president.
I don't know.
There's almost nothing that
I have something.
there's almost nothing that doesn't worry me about the state of criticism right now. Well, that's not fair. That's really unfair. But it has become harder. It gets back to what I said earlier. The question of who is entitled to review a book has been thrown open. Everybody is entitled to review a book. And if I'm going to go to somebody and say, hey, my review that I wrote for Time Magazine is more important or more valid than your review that you wrote for Amazon, the person who wrote the review for Amazon, or if it were me, this is what I would say. I would say, screw you. That's completely not true. Or why would it be true? And I honestly don't know what I would say in response to that person. Why would my aesthetic response to this book be more valid than your aesthetic response to that? There's no reason you can't do that. It's hilarious. You can go through Google Books sometimes, look for the reviews of classics like The Great Gatsby, and they'll be like 1 star. I didn't like the main character. And so on, and you just think, wow, that's totally lame. And then, why should they like Gatsby? And if they didn't like Gatsby, why would they like the book? So, it's made me very aware that of the other things that a critic does rather than put his thumb up or down. And I feel like that stuff has become so much more important, but it's hard to, people it's hard to point to that and say, this is why my review is important, because people can get reviews for free anywhere. It's hard to show people why good reviews are important, but they are.
I'm not as worried as I was about 5 years ago, because 5 years ago, a lot of newspaper book sections were folding, and we were used to having a standalone book section in a lot of places. And you could go to the library and pick it up, you could carry it with you and travel and look for a reviewer's opinion, and it just seemed like that was the way things always had been, and suddenly we went through this amazing transformation. On the one hand, we don't have the standalone book reviews except here in our hometown of New York City. But on the other hand, we have massive websites and literate discussion going on online all the time. You can follow hundreds of Twitter users who are reading books and telling you how they're responding to them all day long. There's more conversation out there, I think. And people are getting random information out there, which is kind of fascinating to me. What I do know about the Book Critics Circle right now is that we are about 25% of us are literary bloggers, and about 40% of us are freelancers as opposed to staff critics. The idea of making a living as a critic has really gotten difficult. There are very few staff critics or book editors left with full-time jobs, so it's much more a freelance world, or it's people who are working in academia who also are reviewing books. But what you can read and what you can get your hands on now is extraordinary. And I think that ultimately, what I've been watching happen is that there are sort of voices that people are beginning to trust. And sometimes they're used to a newspaper, it's now online, they read it online, they trust that kind of the brand of The Guardian or the Los Angeles Times or Ron Charles down at the Washington Post is doing these hilarious 2-minute videos. And he's bringing stand-up comedy.
Brilliant.
Well, yeah, he's amazing.
You should check them out if you have Ron Charles at the Washington Post.
Ron Charles.
His videos, they're just genius.
So there's this opening out of how one goes about reviewing books and keeping the conversation going. I think we are engaging more people in the conversation. And oddly enough, There was a phase I thought film was going to take over from books. You would go to a dinner party and everyone wanted to talk about the movie instead of the book. There are more book groups going on right now. In New York, on Long Island, everywhere I run into people who are reading books, they're going back and reading Proust in groups. I mean, I think the reading that's going on is almost an antidote to the 24/7 being wired into things. People are wanting, okay, I have to be online all day long for professional reasons, but I want to go read books for pleasure and to reconnect with what life is about. Anyway, that's mine.
Jane, I feel so much better than I did 5 minutes ago. Wow. Well, you should have gone first.
No.
Roxanne, do you have anything to add?
I think that you've both said, I mean, who knows? I feel as if we're on a roller coaster. We're just waiting to see what's going to happen to books, what's going to happen in newspapers, if newspapers can make their way into the internet world and pay for themselves with internet ads and stay alive, that would be great. I sort of you must deplore the Amazon reviews too. Yeah, the 1 star for Gatsby. I mean,
I truly don't. I don't deplore them.
well, I do. I mean, that's what people say about books.
It's word of mouth.
They amuse you.
Yeah.
It's word of
My
mouth. Word of
books.
mouth is
But that, well, I don't know. Maybe they're not effective. But I think they do change the public's mind about books, and I think that's too bad. Idiots are out there saying this is a terrible book. You know, I hate the color of the cover, and you know, so somebody. Never mind. I mean, we all have stories that we hate about reviews on Amazon. But so I do deplore them. But Jane's right. There's a huge conversation going on now about books on the internet, which didn't exist 10 years ago, 5 years ago. So I don't know. I don't have an